I want your soul.
5:58 a.m. There is an unexpected turn in the weather this morning, says our local meteorologist. Instead of seeing a warm day, we are getting a snowstorm that sources are saying could turn into the storm of the century. Dad turned off the radio, grumpy as hell this early in the morning. "Oh, it's always the storm of the century with these guys," he muttered, tapping his fingers on the worn steering wheel. His wedding ring clicked against the aged leather. I looked away from it before I could start thinking about Mom. We got along fine, Dad and me, but even with Mom gone, things were still difficult. Drives like this, going to school before anyone else got there, was not always my favorite. And even at home, we felt her absence swallowing us like a cavern. But here, in his old pickup, things were okay today. We were okay. He had work over at the factory, always did, so I always got dropped off to school hours before anyone got there. Teachers got used to seeing me there by myself, doing homework, reading a book, or, since my parents scrounged up enough to get my cell phone, playing games that didn't eat up any of my precious data. And today was no different. The parking lots were empty when we pulled up to the school, and I appreciated my silence. It was a good enough time to think. Call me pretentious, but I don't think people spend enough time thinking on their own these days. Not enough time to process things. When I opened the truck door, it was a biting, awful cold, cutting straight through the jacket I had on. My dad took off his scarf and tossed it over to me. I was a little too old now, too close to being a man for him to wrap me up in the same way that he used to. I looked up into the dark sky, clouds rolling in like tidal waves, and saw the flecks of snow beginning to fall. Dad grunted and started up the truck again, sputtering to life, the only thing in the empty parking lot. "Looks like it'll be a rough one today, son. Try to stay warm." 2:37 p.m. It was 6th period English when we got the announcement, flickering over the intercom. Miss Mealis stopped her lecture on Lord of the Flies for us all to listen. Due to the amount of snowfall, we were going to stay on campus until the snowplows can reach this side of town, the principal droned. "Your parents have been informed that you will be with us until you can safely be picked up. The process for being checked out by your parents will be gone over by your 6th period teacher, where you will stay until we are able to safely release you," he said. "Yes!" Brian Donovan practically shouted in my ear. "I had a chem test after school. There is a God after all," he said. "Settle down, Mr. Donovan," Miss Mealis warned. Even though she was looking at him sitting behind me, I flushed under her gaze. When she saw me turn red, she smiled lightly. I didn't know why I bothered looking away. My giant crush was obvious and was probably flattering to her. Miss Mealis was probably in her mid-30s, really pretty, and unmarried for some reason. Everyone said she was a lesbian, though. She sighed, turning off the projector. "Well, I can't imagine getting any work done with you all knowing that we have a snow day today. So go ahead and stop hiding your cell phones from under your desk or behind books. We all know you have them. You can use them until we figure out what's going on," she said. Everyone laughed and cheered, putting away their books and binders. Some people didn't play on their phones, they just talked about how great it was to get some time off to relax. There was a half hour left in class, and then she basically let us go. It was awesome. I got dragged into some conversation I paid no attention to, instead of glancing around the room and thinking about my classmates. Arlette was there, the cheer captain, who was beautiful and pleasant and smart, the kind of unfair sort of graces that God gives out sometimes. Then, the most unfair of his doings, Delilah, who was an emaciated sort of thin, with hair that stays greasy even after a good washing, doodling away in her sketchbook. Usually for some anime, sharpied fingernails scratching at the pen stars on the backs of her hands. Herman, who was in the marching band and would never shut up about it, and then Nick, also in band and deeply ashamed of it. Also there was Chuck, red-headed and obsessed with her books and stories. There was also some other people whose names I still don't know and can't remember, so they were pretty unremarkable to the world I was in. Brian was probably my best friend. He was also popular, and I guess I was too by association. Brian ran track and I watched. He dated cheerleaders and I hung out in front of the gas stations with them, sipping on a Slurpee while they made out. He was my pal, and also the most annoying human being on the planet. He smacked me in the back of my head as if he read my mind, offended. "You paying attention at all, Davy?" he said. "Nope," I said, shoving him off me. A group of girls sitting around us laughed. 4:13 p.m. The lights above us flickered, stopping all the conversation in the room. It's been an hour or so after the end of the school day now. The outside world was wrapped up in darkness and snow, the light gone, and even though the sunset wasn't there for another few hours, Everyone was unnerved by the sudden quietness. Delilah looked up from her sketches for a moment and then looked back down, apparently undisturbed by the quiet disruption. "Spooky," Miss Mealis deadpanned, rolling her eyes. A few people chuckled, easing some of the tension. "What, you pussycats afraid because of a few flickering lights?" she smiled. "I always liked her, even when I was a kid. Before my brother graduated, she was his teacher. She was always nice to me, called me cute when I was 7. Guess that's all it really took." "We're not supposed to be here this late, you know," Chuck said in a hushed voice. Everyone turned to look at her. "Nobody is supposed to be here after hours," she said. "Well, why not?" Brian asked, obnoxious as ever. "Because of the witch," she snapped. "The one who lives in our school." Brian paused for a second. "That is the dumbest thing I've ever heard." "Language, Mr. Donovan," Miss Mealis interjected. "He's right, though," Arlette said. "What do you mean, a witch that lives in our school? That's insane," Brian asked. Then Chuck said, "No, really, it's true. I read it in the library once, about the history of the school. It used to be an unholy place that witches worshipped and practiced dark magic. They used to perform sacrifices right here, where the school is today. I suppose if you want to tell scary stories to pass the time, I'm fine with that," Miss Mealis said, checking her watch. "I'm going to see what's going on with the other teachers. The phones aren't working, probably because it's after hours. So I'll let you guys know what's happening in a bit," she said. And then she got up and left the classroom, leaving the door slightly ajar in case something happened. Everyone automatically moved their chairs in a circle to listen to Chuck. She was a weirdo, but always told the best stories. With our phones running low on power from playing on them for the past few hours, it was the closest thing to entertainment we could get. The only person who didn't scoot over was Delilah, still drawing away. It was creepy. She was creepy. The lights then flickered overhead again, and Arlette drew closer to me. Brian wagged his eyebrows at me, and I threw an eraser at his head. Chuck cleared her throat. "I found it in the very back of the library when I was a freshman, tucked away on the shelf like nobody wanted me to find it. It was about the history of the school and the land before it was built. It was old and falling apart, like if I sneezed, the whole thing would fall apart into dust. I was really careful when I started reading it," she said. "It turns out that there was a colony here back in the 1700s. It was quiet and good, all God-fearing people, and they prayed every day that the winter would be kind and that the snow would not come. But it came every year, wiping out crops, killing livestock, and often taking the lives of the colonists. Still, they prayed. After years of this happening, the town elders started to wonder, why was this happening? Even after they prayed to God about it," she said. "Because they touched themselves every night," Brian snickered. Arlette then gave him a dirty look and he stopped. "They realized that it was because of a witch," Chuck said. "She lived in the town, a young lady, that they suddenly realized had always been there, even as generations passed. Nobody realized maybe because she had cast a spell on them," Chuck said. "Oh, boo! Cast a spell, my big white ass!" Brian exclaimed. "Shut up, Brian," Arlette said. Chuck then continued. "That she never aged and stayed exactly the same, year after year after year. It turns out that it was her the whole time, and the sacrifices the snow brought her kept her youthful after all this time. When the town elders discovered this, they vowed to get their revenge." The lights then dimmed, then glowed brightly again. Arlette grabbed my arm, squeezing tight. "They found her in the cottage all alone, facing the corner with her head up, chanting her spells in a choked dream. The snow had already begun falling when the elders grabbed her and dragged her out into the town center. She was still chanting, eyes rolled up into the back of her head. The town chief ordered a fire be built so they can burn her, but they couldn't get it kindled with the snow falling so quickly. He tried to tie her hands together, but it was so cold that his fingers would not cooperate. So instead, he took the blacksmith's hammer and nailed her hands to the hanging post. There was no blood, ever. Witches don't bleed. He ripped out her tongue so that he could stop the snowfall, save his town, and she continued to scream. Then he slit her throat, and whatever breath was left in her body exhaled the last of her spell, and the town was blanketed in white, lost until it thawed that spring. New settlers found the entire town, melted out and was gone in the rotten sun. But they never found the witch. The nails were there in the hanging post, but she was gone," Chuck said. "I didn't realize I was digging my nails into my palm until the pain came slow, like a realization. I let go and shook my hands, deep indents into my skin. Arlette did not let go of me. So, the new settlers built Arlena Falls here in Arlena Falls High School. Every year we get major snowfalls. The witch tries to find her next sacrifice. Kids kept disappearing or getting into fatal accidents as the years went by, which is why we're not allowed to stay here late at night," Chuck said. "Uh-huh," Herman protested. "The The marching band stays here late every day, and you don't see us being sacrificed, he said. And the band nerds are prime candidates for virgin sacrifices, Brian yelled. I socked him in the arm. He was my best friend and definitely the most annoying person in the world. Again. Yeah, but the music building is brand new, built like 5 years ago, Chuck countered, so it isn't the same thing. It was eerie now that I thought about it. We weren't allowed to stay late. Campus security and teachers made sure of it, sweeping anyone trying to stay behind. Any nighttime PTA meetings were to be held at City Hall. They said it was because the classrooms here are too small to hold all the parents, but why not use the gym? I stopped myself for a second. This was just another one of Chuck's stories. It was just a way to pass the time. I looked at the clock on the wall and it was nearing 5 o'clock. My dad should be getting out of work any minute. I wondered where he was or if he had even gotten the message from the school. I wondered if he knew what was happening at Arlena Falls High. 6:52 p.m. We were getting snappish with one another fast. Brian was getting on my last nerve. My alone time was precious and it was being eaten up by his loud mouth. So, Chuck, how do we tell if the witch is with us or not? Does she fly in on a broomstick or what? Brian said. There are signs, you idiot, she snapped from her desk. She was looking more and more worried as the minutes ticked by. It seemed like after her story, everyone was more than a little bit freaked out. Arlette moved her stuff over next to me. I should have felt some sort of manly pride at being the one she felt safe around, but I was mostly just uneasy and on edge like everybody else. The outside world was barely visible from our second-story window, gusts of wind occasionally shaking the glass in its frame and making us jump. It sounded like someone was tapping on the windows lining the walls, and we kept saying out loud, as if it made it all better for everybody else. Stupid wind, stupid snow, we'd say. Arlette's stomach then grumbled loudly and she swore under her breath. I wish I had something to offer her, but everyone had already chowed down on whatever snacks they had in their backpacks after school. We didn't even have a stick of gum to split between us. Arlette raised her hand to ask if we could raid the cafeteria or something. Then, as she was the ever-good student, she paused. Wait, where's Miss Mealis? She said. Sure enough, our teacher was gone. She went to check on the other teachers and never came back, and that was hours ago. A cold shiver ran down my spine. I looked around at my classmates. I felt their haunches rise. The already uneasiness of the room shifted into something else. Panic. Nobody needs to panic right now, Arlette instructed us, but I could see it in the tremor of her hands. She was just as scared as the rest of us. I'm sure she's just chatting with other teachers and lost track of time, she said. It's been hours, though, said Nick quietly. Everyone turned to look at him. He's rarely said much this entire time. There's no way she just forgot about us. He paused, scratching at himself nervously. There's just no way. At that point, the power went out and something banged against the windows. Everyone screamed, some running for the door and tripping over backpacks strewn onto the ground. Just as quickly, the lights flickered back on, and the backup generator picked up speed. Kids were now on the floor, rubbing their bruised knees. Some were crying, freaked out as hell. Brian then stood up from where he knelt, gripping the desk as if he was bracing for impact. He looked at me and nodded. Dave and I will go check out the other classrooms and see where Miss Mealis went, he said. Ah, fuck no. I knew there was a reason he was my best friend, but also, fuck that. I ain't going. I didn't want to leave the classroom, but he was already heading out, so I followed him. It's what I did. I picked up the fire extinguisher. We had a school scooter rally earlier in the semester where some expert told us that a fire extinguisher made a great weapon. I didn't know I would ever have to think about that again, but here we are. As we stepped out of the classroom and into the empty hallway, I heard Herman say, wasn't she supposed to tell us how our parents are supposed to pick us up? It was true. I was suddenly filled with dread. What happened to Miss Mealis? Was she okay? Brian led the way. Our classroom was older, a little ways away from the other rooms. So when we got to the first one, we had built up enough adrenaline from the silent anxiety to bust some heads open. Brian knocked and then the door opened, but it was empty. Isn't this Coach Langdon's room? He whispered. He taught 6th period geometry before coaching baseball. Why wouldn't he be here? He said. It was amazing, the kinds of things we rationalized. Well, they probably release students in waves, I said, hearing the franticness of my voice. But I couldn't shake it no matter how hard I tried. And we're one of the last, since we're so far down the hall. Look, man, we should get back. What if the class gets released and we get left behind? I asked. All right, well, I'm going to go check on a couple more classrooms, he said, and he motioned for me to hand him the fire extinguisher, and so I tossed it to him. Okay, I'm going to head back into Miss Mealis' room. I promise I'll accompany you if or when she comes back. I felt like a baby, but being in that empty hallway, staring at that empty classroom, this late after school, and after what I had just heard, was pretty terrifying. I wanted to get back with the group, but Brian chose to go on steadily. We parted ways and I tried to walk and not run back to the classroom. 7:12 p.m. They're all empty. Brian set the fire extinguisher next to him with a clunk. He looked pale as a ghost. They're all gone. The teacher's lounge is empty too. Malus is long gone too, he said. But how could she just leave us here? Arlette stammered. She's our teacher. Come on, I insisted. She didn't just leave us here. Shut up, man, with your stupid hard-on for that dyke. Brian practically exploded. She left us here in the school alone, in this blizzard, and the lights are barely staying on, he exclaimed. No, she couldn't have. She probably went to get help or something. It was so flimsy that I felt stupid saying it. All eyes were on me now. She wouldn't have just left us like this, Brian. Not willingly, at least. Not willingly, Chuck repeated. Her eyes got huge, like saucers. Then she burst into tears. Everyone stared at her. It was just a story, she started crying hard now. It was just a story, she yelled. What was just a story? Herman said, terror in his voice now. The witch thing? Chuck just cried harder, rubbing her mascara all over her cheeks. I didn't think it was real. It couldn't have been. But the signs were there. What are the signs? I asked. First the snow, she sobbed, hiccuping like she was choking. Then everyone leaves. They just disappear. Okay, and then what? The lights then flickered again and everybody screamed now. They dove for one another, trying to grip onto something corporal. Arlette was no longer grabbing my arm. She was glued to her seat in terror, tears streaming down her face. The witch will appear, as one of us, Chuck yelled. A deadly silence fell over the room. The kind of silence only a snowstorm can bring, oppressive and implying something horrible. Brian swallowed audibly. How? How do we know who the witch is? He asked. This is stupid, I said. We're just freaked out. There is no witch. Chuck said it was just a story that she made up. No, I read it, Chuck stated. The book is in the library, and she continued to weep. I found it when Miss Malus assigned us Lord of the Flies. It's right there in the back of the library. Well, how do we know? Brian shouted, commanding the room. I fell silent, watching him pace around the room like an animal. Come on, Chuck, how do we know who the witch is? When she kept crying, he walked up to her and grabbed her shoulder, shaking her hard enough for us to see her teeth click together. Chuck, you need to tell me. Well, she'll be quiet. Not the first person we'd think of. Chuck's voice was breaking now. Not the first person we'd think of, I thought. So we all thought of the same person. We turned to the corner of the classroom where Delilah stood. She was thin, practically swimming in that giant black hoodie of hers. She was always quiet, hidden away in the background. And it turns out, it was her the whole time. She stood there, petrified, staring at us. She couldn't even finish her sentence. She raised her hands as if to protect herself. In the center of her palms were dark circles, stigmata, like she was nailed to a post by her hands. The generator then failed and the lights went out. A gust of wind finally defeated the old windows, shattering them and sending snow and broken glass bits around to the room. It was chaos and everyone was screaming. Brian picked up the fire extinguisher and started making his way to Delilah, who was frozen in fear and babbling incoherently. Ink, she kept shrieking. It's just pen, it's just ink, she said. He moved with such force and I could only think of one thing. I tackled him from behind. Brian, you need to wait. Don't do this, I shouted. He then elbowed me right in the nose and blood gushed down my mouth, down my shirt. I gasped for breath, seeing stars and falling backwards. Delilah then ran for the door. The lights turned on and off again, and then the generator picked up speed and died, coughing up life, and then it went completely out. Everyone chased after her, picking up yardsticks or pencils or pens, hollering and yelling, sounding like war cries. Arlette helped me up, and we ran after them. I was so dizzy, woozy, and I heard Delilah screaming and crying for help. As she pounded down the stairs, everyone was running after her. The doors at the front of the school burst open and she collapsed into a snow pile, running for her life. But everyone was so much faster. Everyone was just so much faster than her. 9:21 p.m. When the ambulance and fire trucks and police finally arrived, we were half frozen to death. They asked, even later on, why we didn't just go back into the school, but they didn't understand, and we couldn't explain it. We couldn't go back inside. The blood outside the school mixed in with the fresh snow like a dropped Coke Slurpee, browning in the bitterly cold air. The paramedics did their best to scrape up what they could to take back with them. The police stood around, shocked and unsure of what to do. This kind of thing just didn't happen in our community, and not in Arlena Falls. They led Brian away, who was silent and flecked with blood and bits. Chuck kept whispering, "Witches don't bleed. Witches never bleed." We were all taken to the police station and then released to our parents. Dad didn't say a word about my bandaged nose, or my black eye, or my choked crying all the way home. I thought about my mom, the emptiness that she left behind. I thought I was going to die right there in the mudroom of our home, gasping for breath. My dad held me like I was a kid again and comforted me. It didn't make anything right, though. In the local paper the next day, there was a headline that read this: "Accident at Arlena Falls High School leads to fatality" by Selena Lamb. When the storm of the century hit Arlena Falls, a greater tragedy occurred when a student, Delilah Chapman, was killed in an accident in the school's courtyard. Sources say that the student in question was well liked by her classmates and was considered a good friend. They say the straight-A student was quiet and never caused any trouble, and was a valued member of the school population. The accident occurred when students were left behind when the school lifted their snow day lockdown. In a very strange occurrence, students did not check their cell phones to see that the lockdown was finished and that they were free to go. School officials say that the teacher of the students left behind, Miss Helena Mealis, is currently on paid administrative leave while the district investigates. Miss Mealis has been a member of the school's faculty for 42 years. Flowers and condolences can be sent to surviving members of the Chapman family, her parents, John and Sylvia, at 4237 Rockwell Drive. For more information, subscribe to the Arlena Falls Gazette.